You ready for the jury, counsel?
We are here.
Mr. Lawbaker, you may cross-examine.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Mr. Kern.
Good afternoon, Counselor.
Did you have a designation or a role in this investigation, or was it just as an investigator and you did what Lieutenant Schaefer asked of you?
I was in charge of the Identification Bureau, and my assignment was to take care of the technical side of the case. And I did things with Schaefer, but he was in charge of the overall investigation, and I took care of the technical matters.
And the technical matters is basically related to kind of keeping an eye on the physical evidence that comes in and then sending it on to DCI for whatever analysis is necessary, correct?
That is correct.
That's only in part. It's also documenting the collection of that evidence, where you got it from, that sort of thing by way of photographs, which you did, correct?
That is correct.
And it's important when you take the photographs, I'm assuming you do that so that people can see it as whatever you're collecting as it lay, correct?
A number of the photographs are taken that way so that you put it in perspective with the time that's collected.
Because once you remove it for the purposes of other examination, it may be difficult to replace it in exactly the same way that you found it, correct?
We don't replace it.
So that's why you have to document it with the photo.
That is correct.
And so it's incredibly important that the photographs are documented before any movement, if possible, of an item that takes place, correct?
That's our first choice.
Now, were you a lieutenant back in 1990?
Yes, sir.
And so was Mr. Schaefer, correct?
That's correct.
So the hierarchy, or at least the assignment of the investigation of Mr. Schaefer wasn't really related to rank. It was just the choice at the time. He had to pick somebody to spearhead the investigation.
That's correct. There were a lot more leads than the investigated. The Schaefer was in charge of the overall investigation, and he had a number of witnesses to be able to work with, and he had a number of detectives that he was supervising at the same time.
And the importance of that investigation early on is to collect anything that may be evidence. Because as I understand it, you don't know what's important, especially early on in an investigation, correct?
No, sir. At the onset, you're not sure where you are.
So you have no idea at the onset, within the first day or two, what may be an important piece of evidence, correct?
That's in the sense, in general, that's exactly what it is. You don't know what's going to be of value and what isn't.
And the concern is you don't want to make assumptions in the investigation about what's true and ignore evidence that might rebut that assumption, correct?
That's the general. In general, that's exactly what you're looking for, is just keep your options open.
And in this case, were you aware that there was a press conference held on the Thursday after the Monday that this took place?
That might very well have been.
Did you have anything to do with the press?
No.
Were you aware that there was a photograph of Mr. Liggins that made it to the paper on that day?
That may very well have occurred.
Okay. Who was in charge of press releases?
Would have been the Department of Public Relations, or the Public Information Officer, and quite frankly, at this point, I can't tell you who that was.
Okay.
I know the CID works very closely with the Chief's office for those types of releases.
And the concern about a major investigation like this, and this was a major investigation, right?
Very much so.
And a very terrible thing happened on that Monday, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and that raises people's passions and people being incensed by what took place, fair enough?
That's a fair assessment.
And sometimes what you're worried about or guarded about is that people in the community may be trying to help. Does that make sense?
That's one of the problems that does come up.
And that can taint what information they ultimately provide to the police because of that desire to help.
You're tempering. You have to temper community interest with the investigation. That when a case like this happens, there's a great deal of community interest. And if you tell the community, consistently tell them, no comment, we have nothing to say, we have nothing to offer, at that point, you're going to have nothing but difficulties dealing with the community. If, by the same token, you say something and it's premature, then you can get assistance from people, which may not necessarily be the assistance you want or need or is correct. So it's a fine line.
Right, there's a balance there because there's a recognition in law enforcement that in a perfect world, you would just rather do your investigation and not reveal anything to the community to avoid those biases that might arise, correct?
Well, there's two types of things. This is, again, that double-edged sword. If you put information in the case out to the community, you also encourage the people who are the fence sitters. You may have information of value and just, well, I don't know if I ought to share that or not. I don't know if this really means anything. And they see the case and they see the publicity on the case and they go, yeah, okay, I guess I should go say something. And that's the type of lead that you wish to generate. And the other side is boy, this is my opportunity to take part in something big. And those are the leads that you don't want to generate. And that is that's a finely divided line of being able to elicit the cooperation of the people you want and not the whims of the easily influenced.
And early on in this investigation, in fact, in that first week, Mr. Liggins was identified as a suspect, correct?
Many of the things that we were looking at were as Mr. Liggins being the suspect.
And a lot of the tests that you did, that you've already testified to, were attempting to tie Mr. Liggins, or attempting to tie Jennifer Lewis to the Peugeot, to the hillside, and that sort of thing, correct?
That's absolutely correct.
And that was in particular what you were focused on, and I believe that was your testimony, correct?
That was exactly what we were looking for. At that point, as suspects were concerned, Mr. Liggins was definitely the person of interest. But we were also curious as to what the laboratory was going to find in the sexual assault kit, if they would find anything on her clothing. And at this point, we didn't know what they were going to find and what else we were going to have. So, I think people were also keeping their options open, while at the same time, Mr. Liggins was definitely rising in interest by the department.
Sure. But you also had other names that were possible suspects at the time.
There were other people that were being interviewed and other people that were considered.
Writing reports for an investigation is something you learned early on in your law enforcement career, isn't it?
That is correct.
And I think it's one of the more mundane things that you have to do, but also one of the most necessary things that you do. Fair enough?
Yes, sir.
And if you do something substantive, if you hear from a witness and talk to them for 20 minutes, if you do something like that, you would write a report, wouldn't you?
Yes, sir.
I mean, you document your moves because you don't know when and if something will go to trial, correct?
That's correct.
And I believe that you had to refer to your notes on occasion here while you're on the stand because it helps refresh your memory, in particular like a case that maybe is 28 years old. Fair enough?
28 years ago, I don't remember days perfectly. I've slept a couple times since then, and you're right, my memory's not perfect.
And that's why you do the report.
That is correct.
And you do it contemporaneously with as much as you can, as close in time as when part of the investigation took place. In other words, you try to either do it that same day or the next day.
Yes, and if you see my first report, it's a summary of multiple days because there's very little time in between. So consequently, a number of activities were summarized and reported out in one incident.
And I'm assuming that you are also taking notes so that you can reflect on those notes and then generate a report.
That is correct.
Was there a department policy about preparing reports related to investigative steps?
The policies were not clearly defined, but in general, when you finished an interview, then you prepared your report. If you had a number of interviews, if you were going from place to place to place, then you may sit down 2 days later and based off of your notes, then you would prepare your reports.
And the report is basically the formal summary or a typed up version of your notes, because I'm guessing you're writing down the notes as you do the investigation.
That is correct.
When you were doing interviews and when you talked to people, did you have the ability to do an audio or a video recording of those interviews?
I did not know, sir, and I didn't do a lot of interviews. If I did an interview, it was in conjunction with something else. So if I was working a scene, we did a search of a residence, and while doing the search of the residence, I talked to one of the neighbors, and then that conversation was summarized in the report from the search of that house, so that it could go to the detective for follow-up if necessary.
And in fact, when you were at that residence, doing a search of that residence, were you approached by an individual that you documented in your report?
I did, yes, sir.
And even if that lead or the information comes from naught, you at least put in the report to memorialize the fact that the event took place.
That is correct.
And the purpose of the reports, I assume, is to make sure that then they go through Lieutenant Schaefer and then ultimately would make their way to the county attorney.
Lieutenant Schaefer was the clearinghouse for all the reports, so that you had one place in the police department where all the reports went, and then they shifted from there to the county attorney's office.
And was there any discussion during the course of this investigation that certain reports shouldn't be produced to the county attorney?
No, that didn't come up.
It was never asked of you?
No, sir. What I did, I did. And regardless whether it did anybody any good or not, that's what went down on paper.
I know you're not the expert on DNA. My understanding is we'll have somebody come in and talk about that. But you do know how to collect evidence for possible DNA or fluid analysis down the road. Fair enough?
Yes, sir.
And the same is true with fingerprintings, hair samples, and fiber samples, correct?
That's correct.
And as we've learned here, technology changes over time, fair enough?
Yes, sir.
DNA, ability to analyze DNA changes over time.
Yes, sir.
Fingerprint analysis, though, has been around a while. Has that gotten better?
It has.
And so it's important to collect what you can and preserve it, because it might be useful again in the future. Fair enough?
That is correct.
I want to direct your attention to State's Exhibit 135. All right, Gene. 135, yes. Do you recognize that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, now, I understand that this map was done to scale. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so the distance between 0 and 200 on your scale equals 200 feet. If I move that scale or bar over to West 12th Street, then that's how you get your 200 plus 40. I believe you said roughly 240 feet from Myrtle Street to the bottom, correct?
That's correct.
Did you, and also I understand that Vine Street here, if you're traveling down 12th around the corner, there is, it goes downhill from there.
That's correct.
And are there bushes on West 12th Street that are on the north side of West 12th Street as they enter into Vine? There's vegetation and bushes?
There was vegetation there at the time, and the neighborhood has developed since then, but at the time it was undeveloped and there was debris back in the bushes.
And you know, bushes, shrubs or something like that, right? And where is 13th Street relative to 12th Street on this map?
It's not.
Okay, it's further north.
It's further north.
Now, if you take, so if this is rough, this is 200 feet, and I know that map in Exhibit 2 is not to scale. But the assumption is 240 feet from Myrtle over to the body. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, based on your knowledge of this area here being roughly 240 feet, okay, did you ever measure the distance from 13th Street to 12th Street?
No, I did not.
Okay. But based on that scale and that map and understanding that from Myrtle to a little over halfway down 12th Street before it begins this curve, is it fair to say it's close to, if not roughly, 3 times that 200 feet?
I'd have to measure it. Most of the city blocks in Davenport, around 300, a little over 300 feet.
Okay.
It's from Myrtle down to Vine is close to 400 feet.
From Myrtle down to where it begins the curve is close to 400 feet.
Yes.
So if you move that out here, you believe that the distance from 13th to 12th Street,
It's going to be probably close to 400 feet.
you don't think it's just a little bit longer?
I'd have to measure it.
Okay. Okay. Really, we could look at the scale that's on 135 and get a sense. Fair enough?
You could do it. I'm not trying to be evasive. I never measured it, so I can't really tell you.
No, I understand that. I understand that. At least 400.
400 feet, I'm not going to argue.
You put a tarp down over where the body was removed from to maintain the site, and then you returned that morning, correct?
That's correct.
That's when you did the walkthrough.
That's correct.
How tall was that fence?
It's about 6 feet.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll do it. And had it rained that morning on the 18th?
At this stage, I can't tell you. I have recollections that it was damp, but I don't know if it rained.
If we had photos that showed it was damp at that next morning, you wouldn't put it with it.
No.
And on the morning of the 18th, were you in possession of that red Peugeot?
Not the morning of the 18th.
And actually, the evening of the 17th, I believe you also determined that there had been a sexual assault in this case. Is that right?
during the autopsy, there was indications of a sexual assault.
So at that time, late in the evening or early in the morning of the 18th, the investigation knew that you were dealing with a sexual assault. There's a sexual assault kit that was procured, and you also knew that you were possibly dealing with an assault. Fair enough?
That's correct.
You examined the Peugeot thoroughly.
Yes, sir.
Did you examine any other vehicles?
There was a red Chevrolet that had been delivered just before the Peugeot, which was the exact opposite of the Peugeot. The Peugeot was clean, it was neat, and the other one was a garbage scow.
And did you examine a white Trans Am?
No, sir.
Were you provided any evidence from a white Trans Am?
No, sir.
Does State's Exhibit 144 look at all familiar to you?
There was not one, but we had, no, sir.
And we as
The evidence text or myself, that did not come to us.
okay. So where would this have been?
I don't know.
I know you can read this, but this is a 2-gallon gas can, correct?
That's correct.
Did you ever have this in your possession to test it for leaks?
No, sir.
Do you know if there was ever any gasoline found in that gas can?
I can't tell you, no, sir.
Were you ever given, as the person, the technician, the evidence technician, were you ever given a 1-gallon gas can to analyze?
No, sir.
Do you know, as the course of this investigation, whether a 1-gallon gas can was ever seized?
No, sir.
We have two different jurisdictions here, Rock Island and Davenport primarily, obviously two different states. Was there an effort made to make sure that evidence collected in Rock Island made its way to Davenport?
Yes, sir, because shortly after the search of the Peugeot, we were in Rock Island. When we'd done the work at the hillside, the photography at the hillside, we went to Rock Island PD and we collected evidence from them. And then that afternoon, it was given to the examiners in the DCI lab who were in Davenport to testify in a different case. And then we had them bring the evidence to the laboratory.
So when the decisions were made about what to send down to DCI for further testing, that included evidence that was collected and gathered in Iowa, in the Davenport area, as well as Illinois, the Rock Island area. Fair enough?
That is correct.
In fact, did you examine fingerprints, items that were found in Rock Island?
I made the identification based off of items that were found in Rock Island.
Right. At Brenda Adams' apartment?
No, they were found at the school.
Okay. What about the hillside inn?
There was, everything that came from the hillside went to DCI.
Did you ever analyze, send to DCI any items taken from a search of an Eddie Zapian's vehicle?
No, sir.
Did you examine yourself or send to DCI any items that were taken from a search of Eddie Zapian's home?
No, sir.
In the course of the investigation and the evidence that you saw, did you ever see any items that were taken from Eddie Zapian and put into evidence?
No, sir.
You did process one residence, fair enough?
That's correct.
And when I say process, what are you looking for?
In the residence that I was looking at, I was looking for shoes that were consistent and also designed with those that had been taken from Mr. Liggins.
You need something to compare it to, right?
Yes. And he had a pair of shoes that were brought to the scene for comparison purposes.
And this residence we're talking about, that was 1301 Vine, is that correct?
That is correct.
Do you know how 1301 Vine came to be something that you should look at?
The house was being rebuilt, it was gutted, and I don't recall how 1301 came on the radar. The fact that it was an empty house, it was a block north of the school, and the question was, did somebody, and specifically had Mr. Liggins been in there? And there were footwear impressions on the floor of the house, and they were not consistent in design with his shoes.
You were able to look at these impressions and make a comparison.
That's correct.
And in order to make a comparison, for example, the fingerprints that you have, and you have to have known prints from an individual, like you obtained from Mr. Liggins, you obtained from Jennifer Lewis, to be able to compare it to at least a then unknown fingerprint that you were able to develop, correct?
That's correct.
So you have to have an idea, you have to have that known. And in this case with the shoes, the known would have been the shoes that were taken from Mr. Liggins, correct?
That is correct.
Were shoes ever taken from Joseph Clem?
No, sir.
You didn't have those in your possession to compare the prints of 1301 Vine to, did you?
That is correct.
Do you know if shoes were ever taken from an Eddie Zapian?
Not to my knowledge.
The only shoes you had to compare to those prints of 1301 Vine were Mr. Liggins, correct?
That is correct.
And that result was negative, right?
That is correct.
As far as the gas can that you had, that had some gasoline in it, you poured that gasoline out and it was actually analyzed, correct?
Yes, sir.
And it couldn't be determined that the gasoline that was in that can was the same gasoline that was found in the Peugeot at the scene. Is that right?
The gasoline that was found on the clothing and the gasoline that was found in the ground at the scene could not be compared. They'd been subjected to heat, they'd been subjected to fire, and at that point a lot of the lighter volatile substances have evaporated. So now you have one form of gasoline that's a trace left behind after a fire, and pure gasoline, which is yet to be burned. And the two of them are not comparable.
Right.
So I know it's gas, but you can't tell it's that gas.
And you emptied the contents of that gas can, correct?
Yes, I did.
And how many gallons was that gas can designed to hold?
3, something like that.
And did you measure the number of milliliters that you got out of that gas can?
I did not.
So what we have is just a visual of the outside of the can where it's a 1/4 inch high roughly in a quart can.
That's correct. And then we sealed the can to keep it from evaporating.
Do you know how many quarts are in a gallon?
4 quarts in a gallon.
And do you know how many milliliters are in a quart?
I'd have to look.
And if it's close to 1,000, would you have an argument about that?
1,000 milliliters going to a liter, and a liter and a quart are fairly close. They're not the same. but
Not quite the same, but it's 900, something like that, right?
Somewhere in there.
Yeah, so a quart is somewhere between 900 and 1,000 milliliters. Correct?
Yes.
Okay, so if you have a 2-gallon gas can, then you would have 8 quarts, correct?
That's correct.
And just shy of 7,000 milliliters if it was full. Fair enough?
I'd have to do the math. I'm not trying to argue with you, but yeah, it's,
Well, if a quart is in between 9 and 1,000, and so let's just call it 950, okay, in between the two. If you have 4 quarts in a gallon, then you have close to 4,000 to that 1 gallon, correct?
it's close.
I'm not asking for the number, but in between 3,000 and 4,000 milliliters.
We're ballparking.
Okay. And the same is true with, if you have 2 gallons, you double that again, right?
Okay.
So you're getting in between 7,000 and 8,000 milliliters in a full 2-gallon gas can.
Somewhere in there.
And then you triple it if it's a 3-gallon gas can, correct?
That's correct.
I'm going to show you State's Exhibit 135 again. And aside from the scale, this was used to measure off from a point of reference, and I understand oftentimes that it was the large rock, because that wasn't going to move, to where you found individual items, correct?
Yes, when we did this and started to locate the individual items, we used the catch basins on Vine Street as a place to start for our north, and then we used the curb, the south curb of 12.
And M was the Z28 hubcap insert, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Did that hubcap insert, did it appear to have dirt or anything on it as if it's been there a while?
I can't tell you now. I don't know.
Well, there's another hubcap found, is that right?
One was more of a full wheel cover.
Excuse me, yes, wheel cover in
Yeah.
G. And G is around the curve, correct?
That's correct.
What, now, the Z28, well, it doesn't have to be, presumably came from a Z28.
That's correct.
Okay. And then G, was any effort made to determine what that wheel cover, what vehicle it may have come from?
No, sir.
No comparisons were made, nothing like that, correct?
It was not my recollection was that it was not an original equipment. It was an aftermarket wheel cover. And it's not, it's not something that I remember as being an OEM, an original equipment. But that's my recollection from 28 years ago.
Understood. Sir, I'm going to show you a photograph on a computer. Does that look familiar?
That looks like the wheel cover.
That's
SG.
Okay. And you were responsible for taking that photograph?
That's correct.
And,
For getting it taken.
oh, okay. So you may have had somebody else take a picture of it?
Yes, sir.
Do you remember seeing that as it lay?
That's what it reminded, that's G.
Okay. And so as you came upon it that morning on the 18th, that's how it looked?
That's correct.
Is that a true and accurate representation of what was out there that day?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Your Honor, we're going to move to admit defendant's Exhibit D.
Objection.
Exhibit D, which was a photo that you want printed.
The same will be true for the next one, Your Honor. Same questions. I'm going to show you
I believe is M.
Yes, sir.
Is that the Z28 insert that you talked about?
That is correct, yes, sir.
And is that a fair and accurate representation of how it laid on that day?
That is correct.
Your Honor, we've moved for the admission of Defendant's Exhibit E.
Objection.
Exhibit E is removed.
And given what you knew about this case, you knew it may be important. Well, you didn't know at that time, but you never know if the type of vehicle that landed in that area would be important, correct?
That is correct.
The tire tracks that we saw on the picture, those weren't related to the investigation because clearly that grass was dead, correct?
That's fair.
Now, when you try to determine what you send to the lab, I believe your testimony was you were attempting to associate with whatever you're sending down with the facts known in the case, correct?
That is correct.
And I think the phrase you use is that you assess its probative value. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And so ultimately in the investigation, you start making decisions about what you believe to be important.
Yes, sir.
And would you agree with me that the investigation is, showing my age here a little bit, like a Polaroid, that develops over time?
Yes, it does.
Okay, and in particular, in this case, it was an investigation. We even have some testimony that part of the investigation and scientific testing was happening as late as 2014, correct?
That is correct.
When you know, I believe you testified that the only residence that you had items from to test would have been at the Hillside Inn and Mr. Liggins' residence at the Hillside Inn. And did you have some from Brenda Adams' apartment as well?
I don't recall anything from her apartment.
Let me ask you this. Hillside, we've heard Hillside referred to quite a bit. As a Davenport police officer, most police officers are extremely familiar with the streets and layout of the town they work in. Would you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
Especially if you're working patrol and things like that, you just know where the streets are. There?
That's correct.
Okay. Is the same true for Davenport police officers? They wouldn't have the same knowledge of Rock Island as they would of Davenport, would they?
No, sir, you're not over there every day.
Yeah. And so, had you actually ever heard of the Hillside Apartments prior to this case?
No, sir.
Had you ever heard of the Hillside Inn prior to this case?
No, sir.
Did you have any knowledge in your investigation in talking with Miss Atkins, for example, that there was a Hillside Apartments and a Hillside Inn?
No, sir.
Now, when you analyze the information or what you received from Mr. Liggins' place in Hillside, you're looking at bed sheets,
Yes, sir.
you look at bedding, you look at clothing, you look at all those things to see if there's anything of evidentiary value on it, correct?
That is correct.
Because you have an understanding early on in the investigation that this involved sexual assault, which oftentimes can leave something behind.
That is correct.
And so not only are you looking for hairs, you'd be looking for fluids, seminal fluids, I believe you said,
Yes, sir.
blood.
Yes, sir.
Did you have a way to look for the presence of blood back in 1990?
For blood, yes, sir.
Okay. Other than just observation, did you have a chemical way or a way to illuminate things to look for the presence of blood?
Yes, sir.
Was that done at Mr. Liggins' place back then?
No, sir, it was not. Not to my knowledge.
But at first, you would want to see whether or not it would appear to be blood. Fair enough?
That's fair.
Okay. Because if there's a sexual assault, as is alleged in this case, there may well be blood, there may well be seminal fluid, there may well be hairs. Fair enough?
That's correct.
And yet, you did not look at anything, any evidence, anything collected from inside that Glenn's residence, did you?
No, I did not.
No bed sheets were collected?
That's correct.
No additional clothing other than the clothing that was collected from Jennifer? There was no clothing collected?
That is correct.
We know no shoes were collected?
That is correct.
Her garbage wasn't examined? Nothing was done there, right?
That would be correct.
Now, I know that you said, well, I believe your testimony was, well, it would have been silly to look at the hair fibers to see if Jennifer and Joseph Glenn had hair at that residence because they lived there. Fair enough?
It's putting it into context. If I find her hair, if I find Joe's fibers on her bed, was it because of sex or was he reading her a bedtime story? I don't know the difference. And therein lies the problem. It's not that you wouldn't associate them, but it's under what conditions. So the value of it is something that, do you have something that's difficult to explain? If Jennifer were at Mr. Liggins or associated with his apartment, that becomes much more problematic because she doesn't live there. I associate her and her father. I've not, what have I done? I've associated two people who live in the same house and I can't tell the conditions under which the evidence was made. So the opportunities are much, there are some things that are still probative, but many of the things that you've been looking for stranger on stranger are not going to be present in a family situation.
We don't know that because the investigation never looked at Jennifer Lewis's bed, for example, correct?
That is correct.
And so you don't know, hairs aside, you don't know that if there was any blood found in that bedroom because it was never searched that way, correct?
It was never searched by us. I don't know what Rock Island did. I can't testify for them.
So you never saw a bed sheet from that residence in your life?
We didn't collect it from the Davenport Police Department, and to my knowledge, Rock Island PD didn't collect it either.
And they were able to collect it obviously from Mr. Liggins' place and get it over to you?
That is correct.
So they would have had the ability had they collected the bed sheet in Jennifer's bed, fair enough?
That is correct.
And the other thing is that if you found Mr. Glenn's pubic hair in Jennifer's bed, that might seem a little odd too, correct?
That becomes problematic, yes, sir.
Okay. But we'll never know because it was never collected.
That is correct.
The same is true for the Glenn's bedroom. No bed sheets, no clothing, no examination for blood, no examination for fluids, no examination for hair or fibers, correct?
Not by us, and to my knowledge, not by Rock Island.
And the same is true for any vehicle if we're in the white trade tank. Fair?
That is correct.
Did you do hair lifting or anything like that, or hair analysis in the white train tank?
No, sir.
Or any other vehicle for that matter, other than the Peugeot?
Only the Peugeot.
So what was done with the red Chevrolet? What did you do to it to examine it?
We took photographs of it, we processed it for prints. The car was absolutely filthy. I was a little glib in one of my other comments about the car. I made a comment that looked like it came from the Oklahoma Dust Bowl. It did not. Had you done something in the inside of that car, it would have disturbed the flora and fauna on the inside. And it looked to me, you couldn't get the car to start. It certainly didn't have the appearance of something that had been involved in transporting a body.
believe you testified that you can't prove a negative. One of the things that happens during the course of an investigation is that people are included or excluded as persons of interest. Fair enough?
That is correct.
When there is a negative, that would tend to look like something that would say that there may be not somebody who should be of interest. Fair enough?
It points toward exculpatory evidence, yes, sir.
What was the answer?
It points toward exculpatory evidence.
I'm going to talk about Miss Atkins.
Who directed you to talk to Miss Atkins?
That was the result of a conversation over at in the detective bureau that we were going to move the car over to the hillside to do some photography of the car, and that she was going to be over there for to point out where the car should be located, and then what did she see.
So it's my understanding that the car, as we see it parked in State's Exhibit 104, that was at the direction of Miss Atkins, correct?
That's correct.
That car wasn't found there when it was towed, correct?
I have no idea where that car started out.
It was driven there by law enforcement because it was already in the custody.
That's correct.
My understanding in State's Exhibit 104, just so you can see it, part of the reason for that photo was to show the relationship between the car and the residence of Mr. Liggins according to Miss Atkins. Fair enough?
I'm going to object that that's a mistake. That was Miss Atkins' boyfriend's apartment 1 at the Hillside Apartments.
Did you testify earlier that it was to show the relationship between that car and Mr. Liggins' apartment?
That was one of the purposes, because he's on the other side of the apartment complex.
Did she identify to you or state to you that Mr. Liggins lived in the Hillside Apartments as opposed to the Hillside Inn?
My understanding, this was done this is done the day after we've already collected the garbage can or the garbage sack. So the garbage sack was collected at 20 minutes after midnight, and then at 10 o'clock in the morning, we're out taking pictures of the car. And at the time that we were collecting the garbage sack, the black hefty bag, at that point we knew that Mr. Liggins' apartment was on the opposite side of the complex of that development. So the car, we know that the car's on the opposite side, so whether it's a Hillside Apartments or him, it's not on that property development. It's not close to where he resides.
Right, as a matter of fact, in State's Exhibit 5, we've got an aerial view of that area, and the place where you parked the car is at Hillside Apartments. I'm pointing to on the fingers for the long skinny building in the center left top of it, and you can see a little red something down there, van or truck, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, and where you collected the trash bags is over at the Hillside Inn in
Right.
Rock Island, which was along the right-hand side of that building, correct?
It's the one that we collected is on the opposite side. Mr. Liggins' apartment was on the area that you just pointed to. And then on the east side of the property, that's where we got the garbage bag.
Maybe, could you come up and show me where you got the garbage bag from on State's Exhibit 5, please? It's difficult to get a point of reference.
Liggins' place is over here, and the garbage bag came over there.
Okay.
Your Honor, if I may, I believe you're back.
Yeah, I'm going
I
to,
believe you're blocking the jury when you...
oh, I'm sorry. What I'll ask is that I think he has a laser pointer, or someone just do that, so they can take a seat and this with her. Do you still have that laser pointer, sir?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Using the laser pointer, can you show us again where Mr. Liggins' apartment was in the Hillside Inn?
His apartment was over here, and we got the garbage bag from over there.
Okay, so those are staircases, aren't they?
That's correct.
Smaller white vertical protrusions from the building?
Those are the stairwells, and at the bottom of the stairwells are storage areas.
And so the bag that you were directed to collect by Lieutenant Shaker was at the one that was opposite from Mr. Liggins' place.
That's correct.
Sorry, sir, I'm badly cold. Now, when you were out there with Miss Atkins at Hillside Apartment, did you place a gas can in the car, or did Miss Atkins?
I can't recall.
Did the gas can have to be removed?
Yeah, we had to remove it because we didn't have it in the back seat of the car. And we didn't take all the pictures with it in the back seat of the car.
So when that vehicle was driven out to Hillside Apartment, the gas can was in, presumably still in the trunk, correct?
It'd be back in the trunk, yes, sir.
And that's where it was found after it was towed. Those are the pictures you took, correct?
That is correct.
So the pictures that show it placed in the back seat of that, did you place it there and then have Miss Atkins review it?
No, I didn't.
Did you contact Scott County Attorney William Davis and consult him prior to placing the gas can in the back seat and
Yes.
allowing Miss Atkins to do the same?
Yes, we did.
Okay, so you contacted him and then placed it in the back seat and then allowed Miss Atkins to view it?
It was, yeah, we had detectives there, and I don't remember which investigator was working with her, but I was there when she was directing where to place it. But we did check with counsel before we did anything like that.
Is the concern that doing something like that can be overly suggestive?
The concern was that, we did not, it's a fine line, and again, I'm not interested in changing somebody's mind. It's one of those that we're putting evidence back, and our policy is that once you move it, you moved it. And once it's moved, then you live with it as it's being moved, and you don't go back and do recreations. That was an exception, and we checked with counsel before we did something that was going to be an exception to that policy.
Why are recreations an exception?
Because we're not in the habit of doing them. Once we collect something, we're done. We're not in the habit of putting it back and saying, well, this is where we think we found it. This is where we did find it. So consequently, evidence-wise from the police department, when we collected something, we lived with it. If you moved it before you photographed it, you lived with that. And this was an exception to the way we normally do business.
Bill Davis was the Scott County attorney at the time that was responsible for prosecuting this case, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay, so you went to him for guidance and he said go ahead.
That is correct.
Now,
discolored area that you found underneath the upholstery, or excuse me, the upholstered seat in the back of the Peugeot. As I understand it, so you simply removed the cushion, fair enough?
We took the cushion out, yes, sir.
And there would be a seam between the cushion and the back of that seat where water could get to, down to below, fair enough?
Fair enough.
You have no indication that that liquid was bleached, correct?
That's correct.
You have no indication that any cleaners were used to create that spot, whatever it may be, correct?
That's correct.
There was no indication that the sponge that was found in the back of the vehicle had been recently used or was wet or had cleaner on it.
That is correct.
There was no indication that the bucket in the back of that car had any fluids or residue from cleaners or anything like that.
That is correct.
In fact, in the back of that car, you found an Armor All spray thing, right, the trunk.
There's Armor All in the trunk, yes, sir.
And Armor All comes in a lot of different versions. That was the spray bottle back there, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And things that can affect moisture in the vehicle would be leaving windows down when it's raining.
That's correct.
Now, when did you take this cushion off? It wasn't like on the 20th of September. It wasn't sometime in October?
October 1st.
And how long had that vehicle been in the possession of the Davenport Police Department?
Since the 20th, the night of the 19th.
So, 10, 11 days.
That's correct.
And you're testifying that the smell test of that liquid was that it wasn't mildewy or have any odors during that 10 or 11 day period?
That is correct.
You had information that Brenda Adams had a daughter, correct?
Yes, sir.
And the information, and that part of why you went back in 2014 and did an additional fingerprint examination related to party favors and gifts, correct?
Yes.
In fact, then you had Jennifer Lewis's nose sample, and you had Sky Adams' nose sample, and then we did that comparison.
That is correct.
And early on in the investigation, you had knowledge that Miss Adams had a young child.
That is correct.
And the water that you found down there, you have no way of knowing if it's related to maybe a child spilling water back there, correct?
I don't know what the origin of the water would be.
Children are riding in the back seat. Well, I'm trying to think about Carson's back in 1990. Not quite sure where we're at on that, but it wouldn't be unusual for children to spill or something like that in the back seat.
You would have had to have spilled all the way across the car. So she would have had to have had a significant amount of water to be able to get it all the way across the seat. From one end of the car to the other.
I mean, you have no idea the source of that liquid.
I don't know where it came from.
How long does it take for something to rust?
I don't know.
Your testimony was an extended period. Do you know how long that is?
I don't know. And the reason I said it was that if this is something that had been an ongoing leak for the car, if this was an ongoing problem, then I would expect that over the years, that this isn't something that happened last night. If in fact it's a recurring phenomenon, then over a period of months you should start to see rust. And I'm not seeing anything that look like this has been something that's been building up.
You don't know what recurring means. If you have a broken window, you don't know if it's fixed in between, you don't know if there's plastic on it, you have no way of knowing at all what water or how much could have gotten in there at any time, correct?
That is correct.
And the same is true if it's related to a spill or something else in the backseat, you got jostled, knocked over, and spilled. You don't know when it would have happened, you have no way of gauging that or knowing the source, correct?
That is correct.
a lot of stuff in that trunk of the Peugeot, fair enough?
Yes, sir.
And is it also fair to say that if you're cleaning or doing something and using the items in that back of that Peugeot, you may have to pick up and move some things to get access to everything that's in the trunk?
That could very easily happen, yes, sir.
I want to talk about the plastic bag. I understand that you had a long day that day before you got the call from Mr. Schaefer to come out to Rock Island, is that right?
That is correct.
Not unusual during these investigations to have long days, is it?
That is correct.
How do you communicate with each other? How did you back in 1990? If Mr. Schaefer needed you, what did he have to do?
Cell phone?
You had cell phones back then?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Nobody had to run to a landline or something like that? You could have just called him?
We use cell phones because you never knew where anybody was.
You didn't have any trouble getting his phone call?
No, sir.
You didn't have any trouble at that time getting what you needed together and meeting him out there, correct?
That is correct.
And that would have been true during the entirety of the investigation. You would have been, assuming you weren't doing something else, available to Mr. Schaefer, as well as somebody likely at the Rock Island Police Department. Fair enough?
That is correct.
Did you ever tell Lieutenant Schaefer, hey, I'm too busy, I don't want to come over?
We tried to work together, and a lot of times you don't know. You did what you could at the time. And the reason we did it was because you didn't know what the next day was going to bring. So you got something done, and then you were ready to go for the next day. So 20 after midnight, you go over, take the photographs, go back home, get ready for work the next day.
Did you ever go over to Rock Island and do some investigation without calling Rock Island or talking to anybody?
I've gone over to Rock Island to go check before testifying. I went over to Rock Island to go check for the lay of the land to see what had changed. Because there's structures that existed in 1990 that no longer exist today. And I went over to the hillside and didn't tell Rock Island I was over there.
That wasn't part of the investigation, that's part of your preparation for testimony.
It was part of trial prep, yes, sir.
How many plastic bags were collected?
We took one that night, and I believe the detectives went back over the next day and got another one. We didn't want to make, 20 after 12, we didn't want to make a big racket with a bunch of cans.
Do you know if the photos that you took were as Mr. Schaefer found the bag or had it been moved some?
I believe he had already moved the door, saw the bag, and that's when he made the call.
But he hadn't moved the bag at all?
Not to my knowledge.
Did you have fingerprint on the door or under the stairs or anywhere out at Hillside Inn?
No, I did not.
Didn't dust for prints, didn't do anything to see if Mr. Liggins left the prints there at that other stairway?
No, sir, I did not.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you like to stand and stretch while we're talking? Please be seated. Mr. Kern, you still on your oath? Any other questions?
Just a couple, Your Honor. May I approach?
Yes, you.
More photos. Kern, does that photo look familiar?
Yes, it does.
Okay, that's a picture of the street by the Glenn's house, is that right?
That's correct.
And the Glenn's house is the full house on the left, is that correct?
It's the one with the porch and the white windows and the lightest color roof,
Okay.
and it's next to the little white car.
Okay, and then there's a boarded up home next door, correct?
That is correct.
Does that look like a fair and accurate depiction of how the Glenn house stood back then?
Back in 1990, yes, sir.
Okay. Move to admit defendant's exhibit for F, Your Honor.
No objection.
Exhibit F is admitted.
Mr. Kern, did you take pictures at the autopsy?
Officer Veneman did the photography at the autopsy.
Okay. But you were
I was
there?
present, yes.
Were you able to then observe Jennifer's body as it was being examined?
Yes, sir.
Were there some scrapes or what appear to be, could be fingernail marks in her skin? You know?
I don't recall. I remember there were marks in her skin where the skin had stretched because of being, it was consistent with being around flammable liquids. I'd have to see what you're talking about.
And I'm going to do that for you in just a second. Sir, you were there for the autopsy. Does that appear to be a photograph of a portion of Jennifer's body as she lied at the autopsy?
That's correct.
Okay, and do you see the injuries or at least the skin issues that she's having on the side of her body there?
Yes, sir.
Okay, is that a true and accurate representation of how she looked on that day?
That is correct.
Okay, we move for admission of State's Exhibit G.
No object, Mr. Rollins.
So we will exhibit G is admitted.
PCI didn't have a lab doing DNA at the time in 1990, correct?
That is correct.
But there were labs around the country that could do that type of analysis, correct?
DNA was, I think you really need to talk to a DNA analyst because the first case in the world was in 1987, and that was in England, not the United States. And when DNA started, you needed to have a large volume of sample to work with because of the techniques that were involved. Today's techniques, we can amplify how much DNA is present, and we didn't have that at the time. And it was very difficult. The early laboratories were Cellmark and Life Codes. Those are the two big laboratories in the United States, and just when they got started, I'm not really, I don't know the dates.
But, and DNA obviously has gotten a lot better. They can try to match people with much smaller samples. I understand that, but was there any effort made to examine or scrape underneath the fingernails of anybody in this case?
I'm going to have to defer. I believe that Dr. Stevens looked under her fingernails to see if there was anything there, because that was standard protocol.
So when you have somebody that may be trying to defend themselves, you look at underneath their fingernails to see if they need to scrape somebody, correct?
That's correct.
And if somebody's assaulting them, it may be important to look at all the people that may be responsible for the assault to see if they have anything in their fingernails, correct?
Yes, sir. If you can get to them fast enough.
Nothing further. Thank you.
Can you repeat that?
Thank you, Your Honor. We wouldn't be able to look under Jennifer's right hand because it was destroyed by fire, is that correct?
That is correct.
And her other hand was also damaged?
it had damage. I was able to get fingerprints from her, but it also had some damage.
Burn damage?
Part of it was burned. Part of her left side was exposure to flammable liquids. The skin was starting to slough. If you look at that photo that we just admitted, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about.
And you have no idea medically what those marks were that Mr. Hoffaker just showed?
I don't know. I'm not a doctor.
I want to talk about the gas can in the trunk and the Mrs. Atkins situation. I just want to clarify something. You said you want to photograph evidence where it is found. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And in fact, that was done with the gas can, right?
That was done the night we recovered it, exactly where it was.
And that would be State's Exhibit 47. The gas can was in the trunk.
That is correct.
So you did, in fact, photograph it where it was found.
Yes, sir.
The unusual thing was moving it later for a demonstration with Mrs. Atkins.
That's correct.
And the purpose of that was for Mrs. Atkins to show the detectives where she saw the gas can at the Hillside Apartments in front of Apartment 1.
That is correct.
And that was done.
Yes, sir.
And you photographed to document that demonstration.
That is correct.
So there wasn't really any problem with moving evidence before it was photographed in that situation, correct?
That's correct.
Regarding police reports, it is desirous that officers write detailed reports in normal circumstances, correct?
That is correct.
But that doesn't always occur.
No, it does not.
And there are times maybe when you have to, well, let me ask you this. If Don Schaefer testified that during this investigation, because it was a multi-jurisdictional investigation, that when agents or officers were teamed up with each other, that only one of those officers, even though from different agencies, only one of them would do a report. Does that seem like a reasonable thing under these circumstances of this investigation?
Yes, sir. I served on a joint terrorism task force, and when we had multiple jurisdictions on cases, which was frequently, one of us did the report. One kept the notes and then did the report.
It's a division of labor.
It is.
Regarding the search at 13th and Vine, was anything of evidentiary value ever recovered from that location related to this murder?
Nothing. There was a bag, but the bag was of a different construction than the type of plastic that was found on her clothing. We found some duct tape, but there was no duct tape that was ever associated with her remains. There were footwear impressions that were photographed for posterity to keep a record of what the footwear impressions looked like, but they were never compared with other shoes other than the ones that were provided, then the LA Gear shoes that were provided from Mr. Liggins.
But ultimately, no evidence that that location, 1301 Vine, had any relation to the murder of Jennifer Lewis?
No, sir.
And regarding trace evidence, whether or not Joe Glenn's, I think he said pubic hair would have been in Jennifer's bed, you said that'd be problematic, but isn't it common that sometimes family members sleep in different beds?
That does happen.
Things can get mixed up in the laundry, depending on how clean people are, that sort of thing.
That also can happen.
So finding somebody's trace evidence in a house they live in is of limited probative value.
That is correct.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Any recross?
I understand the division of labor, but if you're the only one there, say taking a phone call or doing the investigation, you will have nobody to buy that name until you make a report, correct?
That is correct.
Nothing further.
Unless perhaps you're the commander or the supervisor and you assign that particular task to a detective to follow up on.
Yes, that would be correct as well. At that point, you're going to make a lead sheet and you delegate that responsibility to who's working for you.
Thank you, I have nothing further.
Thank you. You may sit down.
Your Honor, the state calls Sabrina C.